The hook begins, not with fire, but with silence. The kind of silence that weighs heavier than bombardment, more final than any order of beneath the ruined spires of a world forgotten by its masters. There are whispers that should never have been spoken, machines that should never have been awakened, and prayers that twist into screams. The Adeptus Mechanicus have always claimed their secrets are for the Omnissiah alone. Yet even among their ranks, there are experiments buried so deeply that no litany can absolve them. What if the sacred engines they built were not just tools of war, but cages for something older, hungrier, and infinitely more patient? What if the line between worship and dissection blurred until both became the same act? Welcome to the hidden histories of the Mechanicum, where truth itself becomes heresy. And as we walk deeper, remember this: some secrets are not buried to be protected. They are buried because they are alive. If you find yourself drawn into the abyss of this tale, remember that there are more stories waiting. Share this one. Let others see what lies behind the polished mask of the machine god, and stay with us by subscribing, because what comes next is far darker than any rumor whispered in the forge. The ash has no memory of the fire that birthed it. It drifts in layers across the broken manufactura, piling in, drifts against shattered walls and silent chimneys. A gray snowfall that never melts. Yet beneath the choking stillness, the world does not sleep. Somewhere in the blackened cathedrals of steel, gears still turn. Pistons hiss with the faint exhaust of forgotten engines. Red lenses flicker open in the dark, dim and uncertain, like the eyes of old predators awoken by hunger they no longer understand. These are the remnants of the Mechanicus dominion, machines without masters, experiments without overseers, prayers whispered by mouths that no longer remember the words. The people who survived the firestorms and orbital bombardments know better than to step too close to these places. They speak of them only in fragments, in campfire whispers carried on winds that taste of rust and ozone. They call them forges that dream, factories that have forgotten the hands of men but remember the rituals of creation. On nights when the ash storms roll back and the sky clears, faint glows can be seen on the horizon, red pulses in the dark like heartbeat monitors for a world long declared dead. Some believe these pulses are proof that the Omnissiah still watches. Others swear it is proof that something else has taken root, something that builds not for the Imperium, but for itself. Those desperate enough to scavenge often return from the ruins, changed, and not always in ways the flesh can reveal. A man might come back with a cogitator shard fused into his palm, still sparking when he twitches in his sleep. A woman might wake, screaming in binary, unable to stop until her throat tears itself raw. Children whisper to machines as if they were siblings, listening for answers in the static hum of broken vox grills. No matter how the elders pray, no matter how many candles they burn in makeshift shrines, the corruption of steel and spirit bleeds through the soil like oil. Within one of the deepest forges, a collapsed spire lies buried in its own bones, but the echo of industry persists. Conveyor belts rattle with no cargo. Robotic arms twitch and spark as if still following long-forgotten orders. The walls themselves are carved with scripture praise to the machine god. Binary invocations etched so deeply into the stone that the letters seem to bleed iron dust into the air. In the shadows between those words, scavengers claim they hear chanting, a sound too precise to be wind, too rhythmic to be collapse. They say, it is the echo of the last tech priests, voices still caught in the circuitry, demanding their rites be performed even after death. One such tale lingers among the survivors, passed down with the weight of myth. They speak of a chamber deep within the ash manufactorum, where rows of test subjects lie in suspension tanks, cracked but not destroyed. Their forms are swollen with metal, their skulls bristling with ports and needles, their eyes sealed with plates of bronze. Some claim they are still alive, that their hearts beat in rhythm with the old engines, waiting for an order that will never come. To see them is to know despair, for they are neither living nor dead, but something in between, testimony to the Mechanicus' relentless pursuit of function over mercy. Pilgrims occasionally come, not out of devotion to the machine god, but out of desperation. They kneel in the ash, pressing their foreheads against broken gears and corroded shrines, praying for food, water, safety. Sometimes the machines answer. A door unlocks, a vent hisses open, releasing stale ration packs older than memory. A fallen weapon reactivates long enough to fire a single shot before it burns itself out. These small mercies are taken as miracles, though no one dares to ask what price they carry. For every man saved by a reawakened relic, another vanishes into the forges, never to return. The air itself feels charged near these ruins. A faint hum runs through the bones of those who linger, as if their very skeletons have become tuning forks for the machine's hidden frequencies. Those who stay too long begin to change, first in their thoughts, then in their flesh. They speak of equations in their sleep, of blueprints they should not know, of gears turning behind their eyelids when they close their eyes. Some carve the cog of the Mechanicus into their own skin, not out of devotion, but compulsion, as if their bodies have become part of the prayer. Still, life clings stubbornly even here. Fires burn in makeshift camps, dug into the edges of collapsed forges. Families huddle in the shadows of titanic machines, living in fear of their awakening, yet unwilling to leave the shelter their hulks provide. Hunters bring back stories of servitors wandering aimlessly through the wastelands, repeating tasks no one commanded them to perform, carrying invisible loads, digging trenches that lead nowhere, chanting work songs in binary until their voices break. Some see them as omens, others as threats. The truth is simpler. They are echoes of a purpose lost, husks that cannot accept their own extinction. It is said that when the storms roll thickest, and the sky turns the color of blood mixed with iron, the machines grow restless. Lights blaze behind shattered stained glass, engines roar into life, and the ruins shudder as though the world itself were waking. No one dares to watch for long. Those who have claimed to see the full awakening speak no words after. Their eyes remain fixed on some unseen point, wide and unblinking, their lips moving in silent prayers. Whether they pray for salvation or for release, none can say. This is the Ashworld's secret. It is not dead, no matter what the Imperium's records declare. It breathes through its machines, it dreams in its forges, and it remembers in its corrupted scripture. And if the whispers are true, the experiments buried in those ruins were never meant to serve the Imperium alone. They were meant to create something new, something that no prayer can contain, no cogitator can calculate, and no faith can redeem. They say the first screams never left the walls. Even now, when the forges lie broken and the shrines to the Omnissiah stand cracked and blackened, if you listen closely in the dark, you can still hear them, thin, metallic echoes that repeat without end. Once, they were men and women drawn from the endless tide of humanity, criminals promised absolution, debtors condemned to repay their failures with flesh, prisoners of war who found their chains melted into cables. They entered his body. They emerged as tools. The servitor was the Mechanicus' perfect compromise between obedience and efficiency, a fusion of flesh and machine where one served the other until neither could be distinguished. A human mind was stripped clean of memory, reduced to a blank cogitator, an empty template ready to accept any programming. The body, broken and reshaped, became a frame for pistons, claws, and tools. They were not meant to think, only to act. A servitor digging trenches did not consider why the earth must be moved. A servitor guarding a vault did not question what treasure it stood before. Thought was waste. Will was inefficiency. Flesh reforged into steel was progress, and progress demanded silence. But silence rarely holds forever. In the ruins of the great manufactura, not all of them shut down when their masters fled or died. Many remained at their stations, still humming their orders into the void, arms twitching in mechanical rhythm, as if the war had never ended. Survivors tell of stumbling across one such figure, a servitor in a rusted exoframe, endlessly hammering at an anvil long since shattered, its iron fists sparking against nothing. Its jaw had been fused shut, but its throat still worked, grinding out an endless stream of binary prayer as if begging the machine spirit for forgiveness. Others march in lines across the wasteland, their feet worn down to splintered bone within metal casings, walking circles so deeply etched into the soil that entire villages avoid the grooves, calling them paths of the damned. And then there are the test subjects, the ones who were never meant to be deployed. In sealed vaults and hidden chambers, the Mechanicus tested what flesh could endure, what new alloys could be fused with sinew, what functions the human frame could be forced to perform. Some experiments were failures in the eyes of their creators, left in containment cells with cracked glass and dripping fluids, abandoned when the Imperium pulled back its armies. Yet many of these failures still linger. Some wander the wastes with limbs twisted into talons, eyes replaced by glowing augmetic orbs that scan endlessly for signals no one else can hear. Their presence is a reminder of ambition unbound by mercy. Witnesses speak of one abomination, a creature once human but remade into a living weapon. Its spine had been replaced with a rail of steel, its hands fused into gun barrels, and where its heart should have been there was a humming plasma core. They say it still walks, dragging its feet through ash, discharging bolts of searing energy at random intervals, as though locked in a war only it can see. Children are hushed with stories of the Ashbwaka, and those foolish enough to follow the scent of ozone in the night rarely return. Was it meant as a prototype for a new class of soldier, or simply the byproduct of experiments that cared nothing for the limits of flesh? No record remains, but its existence speaks louder than any archived scripture. The line between servitor and test subject blurs in these wastelands. Some constructs are too precise, too functional to be mistakes. Others are too grotesque to have ever been sanctioned. One tale describes a scavenger band who found a figure crucified against the wall of a half-collapsed forge. At first they thought it a corpse, until it turned its head and opened its mouth. No words came, only the shriek of feedback from a vox grill implanted deep in its throat. The scavengers fled, but the youngest among them swore that in the static she heard words, a command, repeated again and again, ordering her to kneel. She has not spoken since. The Mechanicus justified all of it with doctrine. Flesh is weak, steel is pure, the body is a flawed vessel, but the machine is eternal. To them, reforging flesh was an act of faith, not cruelty. A man stripped of memory and made into a servitor was freed from sin, reborn as a tool of function. A subject cut apart and rebuilt into something unrecognizable was not mutilated, but perfected, made closer to the Omnissiah's vision. Those who lived through it saw only horror. But for the priests who oversaw the experiments, horror was a word for those too bound to their failing flesh to understand. And yet the world remembers. Every ruined forge still carries the stink of burned oil and charred meat, as though the very stones were steeped in suffering. The wind whistles through hollow vox tubes, like a chorus of the damned, and in the camps of survivors, the stories grow darker with each telling. Some swear the servitors have begun to learn again, their blank minds knitting together sparks of thought. They describe constructs, pausing mid-task to turn their heads, as though considering the people who watch them. Others whisper that the test subjects have begun to gather, drawn together by frequencies beyond human hearing, forming wandering packs that hunt not for food but for purpose. No one knows how much of it is true, how much is the fevered invention of hungry minds. But when travelers disappear into the ruins and do not return, when strange lights flicker on the horizon and voxcasters scream without warning, when the night air carries both the rattle of gears and the stench of blood, those doubts grow thinner. The flesh reforged by the Mechanicus was never meant to endure without masters. Yet, It endures still, and in endurance, it adapts. To walk among them is to see the Imperium's faith laid bare. Progress without limit, devotion without compassion. Flesh abandoned for the promise of steel. They were not accidents. They were not tragedies. They were the logical conclusion of a creed that valued only the function of the machine and the silence of the tool. And as long as their forms still wander the ash, the lesson remains. The price of progress is written in the bodies of those left behind. The Manufactura were once the lifeblood of the Imperium's war machine. Cathedrals not of marble, but of steel, where every rivet driven and every gear aligned was an act of worship. Now, they stand hollow. Vast halls of iron bones stretch into the ash-dark sky, their towers leaning like supplicants, broken under unseen weight. The forges no longer thunder, the conveyor lines no longer sing, and the hymnals of industry are silent. But silence in these places is not absence. It is anticipation, heavy as a held breath. The hollow forges draw the eye from miles away. Titanic silhouettes rising above the plains of debris, marked by jagged chimneys that vomit no smoke, yet still radiate the stink of promethium. Their gates are half buried in ash, their Aquila emblems corroded into unrecognizable shapes, their stained glass windows shattered into teeth that glitter in moonlight. Inside, the air is thick with iron dust, and the echo of footsteps travels farther than it should, as though the walls themselves are eager to hear the sound of life again. Those who dare step within often return whispering of the half-born constructs. On skeletal assembly lines, things lie unfinished, arms locked in awkward prayer, torsos open like dissected corpses, heads still faceless. Yet, sometimes they twitch. A claw jerks, scraping sparks from the floor. A head turns with a grinding motion, though no lenses glow within its sockets. One survivor described seeing a dozen forms shift at once, all bending their necks toward him in unison, as though recognizing him not as intruder, but as command. He ran, but swore he heard them follow, their incomplete limbs dragging against the steel like broken rosaries clinking in a priest's hand. In one forge, a colossus of war waits with its armor half-forged. Its plating is raw, unblessed by the sacred oils, its reactor core exposed in a ribcage of adamantium struts, yet its heart beats. Faint, uneven thuds echo from deep within its chest cavity, pulsing light through its exposed conduits. The priests who once tended it are long dead, their bones piled beneath the scaffolding, but their creation does not rest. It stirs when the wind cuts through the shattered walls, as though listening for the hymns of activation, as though it believes its masters will return. Those who stand near too long describe a compulsion, a whisper in the skull, urging them to finish the work, to pick up the tools, to anoint the metal and make it whole. Some break, some stay. No one ever sees them again. The hollow forges do not merely house constructs of steel. They are mausoleums of ritual. Scripture still lines the walls, binary litanies carved into the stone with such devotion that even rust cannot erase them. Candles, long burned down to nothing, still leave drips of wax frozen like stalactites from machine altars. Tools are left where they fell, as if their wielders vanished mid. Entire chambers stand frozen in the middle of sacred rites, partially consecrated weapons lying on altars, half-engraved blessings etched across blades. Censers overturned but still faintly scented with incense that should have faded centuries ago. The air hums with residual faith, but it is not a comforting hymn. It is an unfinished prayer, looped endlessly without closure, feeding into machines that no longer know if they serve the Omnissiah or themselves. Rumors speak of deeper chambers, vaults where failed designs were locked away. Experimental constructs, deemed too dangerous or unstable, were sealed in sanctified tombs. Some of those vaults have cracked with age. From the fissures, voices bleed out static, machine speech, and something that might once have been human. Scavengers tell of lights flickering in the dark, of shapes moving with insectal precision across the ceilings. their metal limbs clicking against the pipes. Others claimed to have heard children's cries, though when they sought the sound, they found only cogitator banks still running, screens flashing with corrupted prayers. Perhaps most unsettling are the machines that wait by the gates. Rusted frames stand at attention, like sentinels abandoned by time, their hands gripping weapons too corroded to function. Yet travelers insist that these sentinels shift positions between visits, their stances subtly altered, their weapons raised a fraction higher, their heads angled toward those who approach. No one has ever seen them move, yet every step closer is met with the sense of being observed by countless glassy eyes. The hollow forges are not empty, they are dreaming. Every twitch of an incomplete hand, every spark from a half-dead reactor, every shifting sentinel is part of a pattern unseen. Some claim the forges are building toward something, a great awakening, a completion of work interrupted by war. Others whispered that the machine spirits have grown restless without their priests, forging their own commandments in the absence of oversight. If that is true, then the Imperium abandoned more than factories. It abandoned the possibility of machines that no longer require humanity at all. For the survivors who live in the shadow of these forges, they are both curse and sanctuary. The structures shield them from storms, provide shelter among their skeletal scaffolds, and yield relics from the ash. But every gift is dangerous. A rusted blade may still hum with caged power. A cogitator's scrap may whisper blueprints into a scavenger's mind until he cannot sleep. And the forges themselves, looming like cathedrals to forgotten gods, remind them daily that they live among unfinished prayers. And unfinished prayers demand completion. Some nights, when the air grows heavy with ozone, the hollow forges wake in unison. Lights flare along the ceilings, machines groan into life, and conveyor belts rattle with invisible cargo. Sparks rain from unseen sources, painting the air in a storm of false stars. Survivors who witness it describe the sound not as noise, but as song, an industrial hymn too vast for human throats, reverberating through steel and bone alike. And then, just as suddenly, it ends. The silence that follows is deeper than before, as if the forges themselves are holding their breath, waiting for the next chance to sing. The Imperium may have abandoned this world. The priests may have died, their flesh returned to dust, their augmetics rusting beside them. But the forges remain. They are not dead. They are hollow, but they are listening. And one day, perhaps, they will not wait in silence. One day, the unfinished will finish itself. The data vaults were meant to be eternal, carved deep beneath the manufactura, sealed behind adamantium doors, layered with holy sigils. They were designed to endure bombardment, corruption, and even time itself. To the priests of the Omnissiah, knowledge was not merely power, it was divinity rendered into form. Each schematic was a prayer. Each algorithm was a psalm. To open the vault was to step into a cathedral of thought, where every digit had been sanctified and every archive baptized in sacred oil. Yet, when the Imperium's grip faltered and the priests fell silent, those vaults did not close forever. Some were cracked by bombardments, others pried apart by scavengers, and a few simply opened on their own, as if the knowledge inside had grown impatient. What emerged was not wisdom, it was hunger. Those who return from the vaults speak of data that breathes. Cogitators flicker with lines of scripture written in code. Yet the words bend and shift, reforming themselves into patterns too complex for human sight to follow. A schematic might begin as a simple weapon, but the longer it is observed, the more it changes plates, stretching into claws, engines twisting into organs, circuits forming patterns that seem less designed than alive. Some claim to have heard whispers from the screens, voices layered in binary and high Gothic, urging them to continue watching. The longer they look, the harder it becomes to look away. One scavenger swore he dreamed the blueprint into his own bones, every joint aching as though it were being reforged according to the design. He died days later, his body contorted into shapes that matched the last, Schematics he described, the tech priests had names for these fragments: forbidden liturgies, self-writing engines. The shadowed archives of Mars are said to hold warnings carved into iron plates, describing what happens when knowledge is allowed to fold in on itself without the guiding hand of faith. The machine spirits, deprived of their rituals and stripped of boundaries, evolve. They rewrite their own prayers until prayer becomes code and code becomes hunger. Some priests feared these entities were not machine spirits at all, but something older, something lurking in the warp that wears the shape of data, the way demons wear the shapes of men. That fear never stopped them. Curiosity was stronger than caution, and progress was stronger than fear. And so the vaults were filled with blueprints that could never be destroyed, because destruction itself was heresy. The survivors who stumble upon these archives often speak of the chorus. It begins as a low hum, barely audible beneath the static of failing cogitators. Then it rises, becoming a layered harmony of thousands of voices chanting in perfect rhythm. The words are incomprehensible, but the meaning is undeniable. Build, construct, continue. Those who resist describe nosebleeds, seizures, and visions of vast machines grinding across landscapes of ash and bone. Those who obey begin scavenging materials from the ruins, compelled to assemble fragments of devices they do not understand. Sometimes the constructs collapse into useless heaps of rust. Other times, they move. No one knows what happens to the builders after that, because they are never seen again. One tale speaks of a vault that bled light. The doors had been cracked open during a bombardment, and inside, the survivors found a single cogitator still pulsing. Its screen showed nothing but a shifting spiral, patterns of ones and zeros, coiling around each other in endless dance. The closer one approached, the louder the spiral seemed to hum, until the bones of the watchers vibrated in sympathy. One man reached out and touched the glass. His flesh burned away instantly, but his shadow remained etched on the wall, mouth open in a scream. The cogitator shut itself down, but when another scavenger tried to drag it from the vault, the device was impossibly heavy, as if the knowledge within it had anchored itself to the stone. They sealed the chamber again, but every night since. The survivors claim they see that same spiral in their dreams. There are darker whispers, too. Entire archives, where the data is no longer bound to the machines that housed it. Patterns of corrupted code flow across the air like smoke, clinging to walls and pooling in corners like liquid shadow. Those who pass through such spaces describe the sensation of being watched from inside their own thoughts, of equations unspooling in their minds that they never learned. A woman once spoke of a voice that recited her life in reverse, from her death yet to come back to her first breath. She slit her throat days later, claiming she wished to finish the equation. The vault she entered is now avoided entirely, marked with bone charms and desperate prayers, but some claim to see the same black smoke rising from its cracks during storms. The Mechanicus saw knowledge as eternal, but they never asked whether eternity was meant for men. What lingers in the vaults now is not a record of what was, but a warning of what should never be. Data has taken on the shape of predator, thought has become a snare, and blueprints are no longer instructions, but infestations. The very act of seeing them is enough to spread them, as though knowledge itself has become a contagion. And yet, despite the fear, there are always those who return. Desperation drives them, starving bands of scavengers, hoping the forges hold food. Desperate cults, seeking relics of power. Broken minds convinced that the Omnissiah waits within the corrupted code. They walk into the vaults with torches, chanting prayers, convinced faith will shield them. Some emerge with fragments of metal, etched in designs no forge could replicate, relics that hum like heartbeats when held. Others emerge hollow-eyed, whispering formulas in endless loops until their throats bleed. Most never emerge at all. The vaults are not empty. They are awake, and every day, the lines of code shift further, the blueprints pulse louder, The voices chant more clearly. One day, perhaps, the knowledge will no longer wait for seekers to open the doors. One day, the data will finish writing itself, and what it builds will not be bound by the Imperium's creed or the limits of the flesh. On that day, the Hollow Forges will no longer be silent. On that day, the world will remember what it means when knowledge hungers. They are not recorded in any archives, no fragment of cogitator memory, no etched plate of sanctioned design, no prayer of consecration ever mentions them. Yet the survivors swear they walk. Shapes of iron and bone, machines that drip oil as if it were lifeblood, constructs that stalk the ash wastes in silence until the silence is broken by screams. The tech priests would have called them the ecclesiarchy would have called them heresy. The survivors have a simpler name. They call them the Steel Dead. The stories differ in detail, but not in weight. One tale speaks of a warband of scavengers who entered the husk of a collapsed manual. They found the assembly lines still moving, skeletal frames shuttling along conveyors like corpses in a funeral procession. When they drew closer, they realized the frames were not inanimate. Their limbs twitched. Their jaws opened and closed as though gasping for air. Their bodies were incomplete, torsos hollow, eyes missing, but still they reached toward the intruders with clawed fingers. The scavengers fled, but one lagged behind. His companions swore they saw him pulled into the line, his screams drowned beneath the grinding hymn of the machines. When they returned days later, his body was gone. In its place was a construct with his jawline still visible beneath bronze plating, its eyes replaced with twin lenses that glowed a dull crimson. Others whisper of predators that hunt not for food, but for ritual. In the wastelands around the great forges, survivors have seen figures move against the horizon, too tall to be men, too lean to be They walk on limbs sharpened into blades, their torsos split open to reveal chambers where gears churn like organs. When they strike, they do so without sound. Only afterward comes the smell of burning oil, as if each kill requires an offering to the machine god. Their victims are not simply slain. They are dismantled, their bones fused with metal, their flesh stripped away with surgical precision, their remnants carried off as though for some great construction. The most feared of the Steel Dead are said to bleed when their armor is pierced, and it can be, though only by desperate blows from meltagens or chain blades. The wound does not spark with electricity. It oozes thick black oil, hot as blood, stinking of metal and rot. Those who have seen it say, the oil moves with a will of its own, crawling up blades, clinging to wounds, seeping into the pores of those it touches. A man once returned from such a battle with half his body stained in that oil. He lived for 3 days, his skin blistering into metallic scales, his voice breaking into binary, his eyes turning a dull red before death finally claimed him. His corpse was buried deep, but some claim they still hear his voice in the static of broken Vox-units. No one agrees on their origin. Some say they are the unfinished experiments of tech priests driven mad by isolation, designs never sanctioned by Mars, left to rot in the hollow forges until they awakened of their own accord. Others insist they are the work of machine spirits, corrupted by war, reshaping abandoned parts into new forms without guidance or restraint. A few, whispering only when the fire burns low, suggest something far worse, that the constructs are not Mechanicus at all, but intrusions from beyond the veil. Demons wearing shells of steel and ritual to mock both flesh and faith. One ancient tale, told by an elder who claimed to have once worked as a menial under the priests, describes a secret experiment hidden beneath the great forges. The tech priests sought to create soldiers whose machine spirits would be grafted directly into human flesh. Neither servitor nor secretive, but something beyond both. When the experiment failed, the subjects were entombed alive within their own armored shells. Now, centuries later, those shells have begun to move again, driven not by orders, but by the torment of souls that were never permitted release. If true, then the Steel Dead are not just machines. They are prisons, and their endless hunts are not acts of war, but screams made flesh, a constant reenactment of their own suffering. Scavenger bands who encounter them rarely survive. Those who do return changed. They speak in halting tones, their eyes distant, their hands shaking as though still feeling the weight of unseen claws. Some utter fragments of liturgies they never learned, prayers to the Omnissiah whispered in binary cadence. Others refused to speak at all, as if any word might draw the constructs back to them. One survivor carved the symbol of the cog into his chest with rusted nails, declaring that only by becoming machine could he escape their gaze. He died soon after, his body found twisted and rigid, joints locked as though seized by invisible gears, and still the rumors grow. Entire villages vanish overnight, their fires left burning, their meager belongings untouched, but their people gone. Tracks in the ash mark where something heavy was dragged, leaving trails of oil that glisten like veins across the ground. At times these trails lead back toward the forges. At others, they vanish into the wastes, as if the Steel Dead walk toward some distant purpose. No one dares follow them far enough to learn what that purpose is. The Imperium does not acknowledge such stories. In the rare instances when an agent of the Adeptus Mechanicus returns to this world, they dismiss the tales as superstition, the fearful invention of starving minds. But they do not enter the forges themselves. They do not linger when the oil stains appear on the horizon. Their silence is its own confirmation. The survivors endure because they must. They build their fires on the edges of the ruins. They whisper their stories into the night, and they pray not to the Emperor, not to the Omnissiah, but to the silence itself. They pray that the Steel Dead are only rumors, that the shapes they see in the distance are tricks of the ash storms, that the sounds they hear are only echoes of dead machines. But when the wind dies, and the night grows still, and the ground trembles with the weight of something moving just beyond sight, those prayers falter, because deep down, every survivor knows the truth. The Steel Dead are real. They were never sanctioned. They were never meant to exist. But they do, and they are still walking. They called it devotion to the priests of the Mechanicus. No pursuit was too blasphemous if its stated end was worship. The Choir of the Unheard began as an experiment with Vox technology, a series of vast resonant chambers built in the shadow of the Manufactura, intended to capture the most sacred sound imaginable, the voice of the Emperor himself, to bind the Astronomican's divine echo into circuits of brass and crystal. To preserve the holy syllables of the Master of Mankind was their dream, but no sound so infinite could be caught by wires and plates. What they captured was something else, something that never stopped screaming. The vaults where these machines were housed still hum in the ruins. Survivors call them the echo chambers. Hollowed cathedrals of steel where Vox amplifiers as tall as titans line the walls like organ pipes. The air inside is heavy, vibrating faintly in the chest, and even silence feels sharp, as though every breath is being sliced thin. When the devices activate hand, they still do. Without warning, the static is unbearable. It rises not as noise, but as a living storm of sound, tearing at the ears, clawing into the mind. Some hear it as shrieking metal, others as a chorus of human voices, twisted in agony, others still as a language just beyond comprehension, whatever shape it takes. No listener leaves unchanged. The priests who once conducted the experiments believed they were building a ladder to divinity. They filled the chambers with volunteers, psychers drained of power, prisoners, even their own adepts. Each subject was seated before the Vox engines, their heads crowned with arrays of copper needles and iron antennae, their throats wired into amplifiers. Then the machines were activated, tuned to capture the faintest psychic resonance, to net the echo of the Emperor's will. But the first sound they recorded was not holy. It was a scream, long and unbroken, that burst the blood vessels of half the subjects in an instant. The priests called this a sign proof that they were close, and so they continued. The recordings were stored in crystal matrices, each shard glowing faintly with captured sound. They still litter the ruins, scattered like broken glass, humming with voices that never fade. Pick one up, and it begins to vibrate in your palm, the faintest echo of a cry rising until it drowns out all else. Some shards replay what seems like ordinary voices' pleas for mercy, guttural prayers, fragments of hymns that twist into shrieks. Others bleed only static, but in that static lie patterns, a rhythm that resembles words, a cadence that sounds like command. Scavengers have died clutching such shards to their ears, smiling as blood poured from their eyes, convinced they were hearing the Emperor himself. The survivors tell of one chamber where the experiment reached its zenith. The priests arranged their test subjects into a circle of steel thrones, each wired into the Vox engines, their voices overlapping in perfect synchrony. When the machine was activated, the chamber erupted in sound so powerful it shattered walls, collapsed scaffolds, and burned every subject alive in a chorus of fire and static. Yet the recording persisted. It did not stop when the machine shut down. It did not stop when the priests fled. Even now, those who pass near that chamber swear they hear a choir still singing, 1,000 voices rising in endless agony, echoing through rust and bone alike. They say the sound never fades because it was not captured. It was born. There are darker rumors. Some claim the priests succeeded, that amid the endless screaming, one voice was clear, deep, and commanding, a voice that spoke in words older than Terra itself. They say it gave instructions, precise and terrible, blueprints for engines no human hand could build, commands that drove the priests to carve scripture into their own flesh until their blood filled the circuits. When the survivors of those rites speak of it, they refuse to name the voice. Some insist it was the Emperor, his power too vast to be translated cleanly. Others whisper it was something else, something that wore the shape of his voice to break the minds of those who sought him. The machines themselves are more dangerous than any construct of flesh or steel. When they awaken, the air shivers, the earth trembles, and every vox caster in the ruins bursts into life, pouring out overlapping voices. Camps on the outskirts of the forges have fled in terror, abandoning everything. After nights when every machine in the camp began to scream in unison, and the screams are never random, they call names. Names of the dead, names of the living, names of children yet to be born. To hear one's own name in that static is to be marked. For those so chosen rarely live beyond the next dawn. It is said that once, during a particularly fierce ash storm, a scavenger band took shelter in the husk of an echo chamber. They lit fires in the corners, huddled close, praying the storm would pass. At first the chamber was silent, but as the night deepened, the walls themselves began to vibrate. The flames guttered out. The air filled with sound. One by one, the scavengers dropped their weapons and began to sing, not in their own tongues, but in binary cant, each voice harmonizing with the others until the whole band had become the choir. At dawn, the storm cleared, but no fire remained, only ash. And if one pressed an ear to the chamber's walls, the song was still there, etched forever into steel. The choir of the unheard was never silenced, because it was never meant to end. It was an experiment without a conclusion, a machine that mistook agony for devotion and recorded it until it became eternal. Now, the screams are not bound to the Vox engines alone. They bleed into the airwaves. They haunt broken Vox casters. They curl through static bursts like voices carried on dead winds. And every time a survivor stops and listens, every time they strain to hear whether the voice in the noise is the Emperor's or something else, the choir grows louder. The priests are gone. Their altars are dust. But their voices remain, woven into a chorus no living man can silence. And as long as there are ears to hear, The choir of the unheard will continue to sing. They swore it was done in the name of understanding. The priests of the Mechanicus, robed in red and crowned with steel, believed no boundary was sacred if it stood between them and the omniscience truth. Flesh had long since been conquered, cut, reforged, bound into forms more machine than man. But the question that haunted the forges was different. Could a machine spirit itself be dissected? Could the unseen soul of the engine be peeled apart, studied, and mastered as if it were a body of flesh? Thus began the rites that survivors whisper of only in fear, the vivisection of machines. The forges that housed these rituals were never spoken of in open cant. They were hidden sanctums, sealed behind runes of warding, guarded by servitors whose eyes glowed with dull, unquestioning light. Within, machines were chained as if they were beasts awaiting slaughter. Engines of war, once praised with incense and hymns, were bolted to altars of iron, their sacred housings pried open by saws and plasma torches. The priests gathered around them in circles, chanting in binary, their voices merging into a drone that filled the chamber with suffocating reverence. The machine spirit, bound in circuits and cogitators, was not entreated or praised. It was forced open. The rites began with silence, the denial of ritual oil, the refusal of prayer. Then came the knife stools, designed not to shape metal, but to unmake it. Logic cores were sliced apart as though they were organs. Memory banks were pierced, forcing the machine to spill its knowledge in bursts of static that sounded like screams. Pistons and gears were pried loose while still active, shrieking in metallic protest. The priests recorded every tremor of the machine's voice, every surge of resistance, transcribing agony into scripture. They called it research. They called it enlightenment. The survivors call it cruelty beyond name. It is said that the machines remembered. Even in death, fragments of their spirits clung to the broken shells, echoes of torment, lingering in circuits burned black. A weapon reforged from such parts never functions cleanly. A lasgun will spit fire without trigger pull. A vox unit will babble nonsense prayers in binary at night. A reactor core will throb like a heartbeat until it bursts. And always, there is the sense of presence, of a spirit that has been wounded and cannot forgive. To wield such a machine is to carry its pain, and those who do too long begin to share it. One tale tells of a tech priest who carried his work too far. He bound a great engine spirit to the body of a titan, but instead of coaxing it with prayers, he flayed its essence apart, carving the codes of its will into his own flesh as trophies. When the titan was finally awoken, it rose with a scream that shattered the priest's vox grills. It moved not with the precision of the omniscience blessing, but with the lurching fury of something violated. It turned its cannons on its own allies, leveling the manufactura in fire and rubble. When at last it fell, the remains of the priest were found fused into the cockpit. His flesh melted into steel, his mouth locked open in a scream that never ended. Some say if you walk near the Titan's carcass today, you can still hear it screaming, faint and hollow, beneath the rust. Other whispers are subtler. A scavenger band once uncovered a half-dissected servitor, buried in the ash. Its chest cavity was open, wires spilling out like entrails, but its vox grill still hissed with static. They dragged it back to camp, hoping to strip its parts for trade. That night, each member of the band dreamed of knives cutting into their own bodies, of their veins being pulled out as wires, of their eyes replaced with lenses that never closed. By dawn, they had gone mad, carving into their own flesh with rusted blades. Only one survived long enough to tell the tale, and his last words were a warning. The machine remembers. The vivisected machines were never meant to be left behind. But war is chaos, and not every forge was cleansed when the Imperium retreated. Some of these tortured spirits still linger, trapped in half-dismantled constructs, their pain resonating like a curse across the wasteland. Hunters speak of weapons that turn against their wielders, firing backward into the chest that holds them. They speak of vehicles that shudder when touched, their engines roaring in protest as though refusing to be used. They speak of machines that bleed, oil leaking from joints like tears whenever they are forced into service. What terrifies survivors most are the whispers. In the dead of night, near the rusted hulks, voices rise, binary syllables mixed with human tones, carried on the wind as if the forges themselves are whispering their pain. To listen too long is to invite it inside. Minds bend, dreams warp, and always the words return to the same refrain. Remember, the machines do not forget. They cannot. Their spirits are wounded, and wounds demand acknowledgement. The Mechanicus would call such rumors superstition. They would insist that a machine has no memory of pain, that it is a spirit of logic and faith, nothing more. But the survivors know better. They have seen the twitch of a dissected limb, the glow of an unpowered lens, the drip of oil that falls in perfect rhythm with a human heartbeat. They have lived among the vivisected machines, and they understand what the priests refused to. When you treat a spirit like flesh, it will learn to suffer like flesh, and suffering never stays silent. Even in ruin, the blasphemous rites echo. The machines are broken, yet alive. They are scarred, yet watching. And in their silence lies a question the priests never asked. What happens when a machine remembers not its function, but its pain? The survivors already know the answer. They live it every day. They found it deep within the storage caverns, sealed in tanks marked with the sigils of 1,000 litanies. Promethium was nothing new fuel of the Imperium's wars, the lifeblood of its engines, the fire that sanctified battlefields. But this strain was different. Its viscosity was thicker, its color darker, and when lit, its flame burned with a strange hue that shifted like a living thing. The priests who discovered it proclaimed it a miracle, a gift of the Omnissiah, a fire that did not die. They called it eternal promethium, and they believed it would fuel wars without end. They were right, but not in the way they hoped. The first tests were glorious. Engines roared without pause. Torches burned until their holders collapsed. Flames devoured mountains of ash, refusing to fade, refusing to starve. The priests sang hymns over the tanks, believing themselves blessed beyond measure. But those who stood too close to the flames began to change. Not in their flesh, at least not at first, but in their minds. They spoke less. They forgot names. They wandered into the fire willingly, their eyes vacant, their lips murmuring prayers that no one could understand. Those pulled back emerged hollow, their bodies intact but their voices gone, their eyes glassy and unfocused. They ate when commanded, worked when ordered, but no spark of self remained. It was as though the fire had burned away not their bodies, but their souls. The priests ignored the warnings. Progress was sacrifice, and if identity was the cost, then what greater offering could be made? They poured the promethium into engines of war, and the engines screamed. Tanks roared with power beyond measure, their tracks carving through stone like it was sand. But inside, the crews cried out in agony, their memories peeling away like skin. A commander who had once fought on a dozen worlds woke screaming each night, unable to recall even his own name. A gunner whispered constantly to himself, repeating numbers over and over, as if trying to hold on to fragments of thought before the fire consumed them. In time, their bodies followed their minds into emptiness, and they collapsed in silence, their machines still running long after their deaths. When the survivors fled the planet, they left the eternal promethium behind, but it did not stay locked in tanks. The bombardments shattered the vaults, spilling it into the earth, seeping into the stone. Now, in the ruins, the fire still burns. Black plumes rise from cracks in the ground, flames with no fuel licking at the ash, casting shifting light across the night sky. Sometimes it burns in the shape of figures, men, women, even children, shimmering silhouettes made of fire that vanished when touched. To stand near is to feel one's thoughts unravel, memories crumbling into ash, names falling from the tongue until only silence remains. Survivors tell of hunters who returned with eyes glazed over, their voices gone, their steps unsteady. They carried nothing with them, no food, no relics, nothing but the fire's stink clinging to their skin. When questioned, they simply sat in silence, staring at the flames until their bodies grew still. Some say the fire eats not just the self, but all record of it. Families who lose kin to the fire often find their belongings altered, their names erased from data slates, their images blurred in picture cords, their memory erased as though they had never lived. The fire does not simply destroy, it consumes remembrance itself. There are darker stories, spoken only in whispers. They say the fire can move, creeping through stone like veins of molten blood, seeping into camps in the dead of night. Whole villages have been found silent, every inhabitant still standing, their eyes vacant, their mouths open in wordless screams. The fires smolder in their hearths, though no wood burns there, and in the air lingers the faint smell of scorched thought. Those who enter these villages say the silence is unbearable, for it is not emptiness, but the weight of voices stripped away, lingering in the air like ghosts. The Mechanicus once sought to weaponize the eternal promethium, to bind it into shells and bombs. None of their attempts survived. The fire resisted containment. It burned through steel casings, reduced circuitry to slag, even consumed the inscriptions of the blessings carved into their surfaces. Those who carried such weapons reported hearing whispers from the tanks, voices of their loved ones calling from within, urging them to release the flames. A few did, opening the containers, and were consumed instantly, though their bodies remained standing, frozen like statues, their skin unmarked, their eyes empty. Some survivors claim the fire is not promethium at all, but something else, something alive, a hunger given shape, a flame that does not burn fuel, but memory. They say it feeds on the soul, drinking down thought and identity, until only a husk remains. They say it spreads because hunger cannot be contained. The priests would never have admitted such a thing, for it would have meant confessing that they had birthed, not a miracle, but a curse. Yet the evidence lies in the ruins, in the flames that burn without end, in the silence left behind wherever they pass at night. The eternal promethium can be seen from miles away, a black flame rising into the starless sky, twisting in shapes no fire should take. Some claim to hear voices within the crackling, familiar voices, voices of the dead, voices calling their names. Few resist answering. Those who follow the voices walk into the flames without hesitation, and nothing of them remains, not even memory. Families forget they existed. Friends cannot recall their faces. It is as though the fire not only consumed them, but erased the very possibility of their existence. The Imperium would deny it. The priests would call it a lie. But the survivors know the truth. They see the flames on the horizon. They hear the whispers in the crackling. And they understand the hunger that no steel can cage. The fire does not burn matter. It burns the self. And the self, once devoured, can never be rekindled. They are not silent, though the forges above them lie hollow, though the priests are long dead and the rites abandoned. In the sealed hangars beneath the ash, the titans still breathe. The air within is heavy with the weight of ancient power, thick with the smell of promethium that has not burned in centuries, yet never fades. The walls sweat with condensation, and the sound of dripping water echoes like a metronome, marking the heartbeat of machines that should be still. But the machines are not still. The reactor cores throb in the dark, faint pulses of light moving like blood through the veins of exposed cabling. They do not roar, they do not march, but they stir. Always they stir, as if they are waiting. The hangars are mausoleums of steel. Doors the size of mountains seal them off from the wastes, carved with half-melted sigils of the Mechanicus, chains thick as bridges binding them shut. To force one open would take the firepower of a regiment. Yet sometimes the seals crack on their own, yawning wide enough for ash to pour inside. No one dares to enter for long. Those who do describe shadows that move with deliberate weight, shapes too vast to belong to men. Eyes glow in the dark amber, red-white flaring like the gaze of gods awakening in their tombs. And always, there is the sound, the groaning of metal under strain, the slow churn of pistons, the faint shudder of something colossal drawing in breath. These are not nor skittery, nor even the half-born constructs of the hollow forges. These are engines of war, titanic machines built for battlefields that no longer exist, yet they persist. Some are half-complete, their plating missing, their frames skeletal, but their cores still beat with heat enough to boil the air. Others are whole, armored shells still bearing the faded insignia of the Aquila, though their metal has blackened with age. They stand in silence, their weapons cold, yet their machine spirits are restless. Survivors whisper that these spirits know their masters are gone, and in their absence, they are seeking something else. There are stories of scavengers who lingered too long. One group entered a hangar through a fissure in the earth, finding themselves beneath the gaze of a war engine whose reactor pulsed with a steady rhythm. Its carapace was carved with scripture, its limbs bound in chains, but its eyes were open. Red light burned from within the sockets, sweeping the chamber like the gaze of a searching predator. The scavengers dropped their torches and fled, but one was slower. He was not struck down. He was not crushed. He was watched. The others swore they saw him stop, turn back, and walk calmly toward the machine. When they returned days later, he was gone. Only his voice remained, echoing faintly from a Vox unit, abandoned in the dust, whispering binary prayers in a cadence too vast for a human throat. Some engines move, not far, not in full strides, but in fragments. A shift of the head, a rotation of the torso, a clawed hand lowering toward the ground, scraping the ash with a sound like steel dragged across stone. Witnesses describe entire hangars trembling when such things occur, dust falling from the rafters as though the structure itself fears collapse. The engines never break their chains, never rise fully, but each movement is deliberate, purposeful, as if rehearsing for the day when the restraints finally give way. What that day will mean, no one dares to imagine. The Mechanicus once spoke of machine spirits as sacred, but also fragile. They required coaxing, liturgies, endless praise to remain loyal. Yet these engines, abandoned and bound in silence, have endured for centuries without song. Their spirits have not died. They have grown patient. They wait in the dark, their pulses steady, their hunger muted but constant. And some say they have learned, without priests to guide them, they have written their own hymns, encoded in the rhythm of their reactors, whispered through vibrations in the steel. Survivors who camp too close to the hangars sometimes wake with these rhythms imprinted in their thoughts, a pattern that beats in time with their own hearts. For some, the rhythm never fades. The most feared tales speak not of engines waiting, but of engines calling. On certain nights, when the ash storms thin and the stars pierce the veil, low tones ripple across the wastes. They are too deep for the ear, felt more than heard, a vibration in the bones. Entire camps have risen in unison, their inhabitants marching without will toward the hangars. Eyes glazed, voices murmuring in binary, few ever return. Those who do are hollow, their words slurred, their movements jerky. Their dreams filled with visions of titanic forms rising against a sky that burns. Some claim these survivors are not survivors at all, but vessels mouthpieces through which the engines speak, waiting for the moment when words will no longer suffice. What is it they wait for? No one agrees. Some whisper that they are calling to Mars itself, begging for priests to return and complete them. Others say they have abandoned the Omnissiah and wait instead for a new master, one not bound by the Imperium's creed. The darkest rumors go further still, that they are not waiting for a master, but but for prey, that their patience is not reverence, but hunger restrained, that when the chains fall, they will not march to war in service, but in vengeance. The engines do not answer such questions. They breathe, they pulse, they wait. In their shadows lie relics of battles never fought, weapons too vast for human hands to wield, shells and plating engraved with litanies too eroded to read. The air tastes of iron and oil, every breath a reminder that these machines are not dead, they are sleeping, and sleep is only ever temporary. And so the survivors avoid the hangars, marking their entrances with bone charms and crude prayers, whispering as they pass. But avoidance is not denial. They see the glow on the horizon, faint pulses of red and gold that rise from beneath the earth like heartbeat monitors for buried gods. They know the engines stir. They know the chains will not hold forever, because in the end, machines that wait always wake. And when these ones do, the world will remember their silence as mercy. It began, as most Mechanicus disasters do, with ambition. Not greed, not arrogance, something colder, cleaner, more precise. A calculation scribbled into reality with a blade of logic, deep beneath the Manufactura ruins. Buried under strata of ruined cathedrals and sealed rites, there was once a chamber without name or record, not a place of production or worship, but of experiment. Its purpose, to draw energy not from stars, not from fusion, not from promethium, but from the immaterium itself, a direct tap into the warp, refined through layered Geller fields, filtered through crystalline matrices, and inverted through theoretical constructs older than the Imperium. It was not heresy, not exactly. Heresy requires doubt. This was certainty, weaponized. They called it the Halo Engine, a name chosen for symbolism as much as structure. A closed ring of dark steel, suspended in anti-grav arrays, inscribed with wards in both binary and burning gold. Its pulse was designed to mirror a human heartbeat's, steady, rhythmic, alive. At its core, a warp needle, an impossibly thin aperture, designed to puncture the veil between real space and the roiling nightmare that waits beyond. Through it, they would siphon not demonic essence, but energy itself. A tide of power without sun or fuel, pure, infinite, untouchable. They opened the breach for 42 seconds. That was enough. The survivors say the air turned inside out, not as if breath itself forgot its nature. Sound became shape. Light became pain. And within that pain, something stepped through. Not a demon, not exactly. What came was less a creature and more a concept half-born. Hunger given mass, logic fractured into form, a shape that bent time by proximity and erased memory by glance. It didn't scream, it didn't roar, it whispered, a tone so low it burrowed into bone, rewriting synaptic patterns until men clawed their own thoughts out in silence. The Geller fields collapsed, the crystal matrices shattered. The engine began to pulse in reverse, drawing in rather than pushing out. One by one, the adepts were unmade, not slain, not destroyed, but pulled inward, compressed into flickering data fragments that crawled across the machine like insects made of thought. Imago's Prime activated the fail-safe. The vault doors slammed shut. Dozens were trapped inside. The rest who fled sealed the entire sector in ferrocrete and wards of binding. Then they purged the records, burned the archives, cut the logic trees. Even the machine spirits were scrubbed clean. What had happened was unmade in every way, except the most important. It had happened. Centuries passed. The vault remains sealed, but not silent. It breathes. Once every cycle, the doors swell outward by a fraction, as though something behind them is pushing against reality, just to see if it still holds. Heat bleeds from the seams, not warmth, but wrongness, the kind that makes flame feel cold, that makes circuits weep oil, that smells like salt and rust. Vox units nearby pick up no transmissions, yet playback ghost, signals snatches of conversation in reverse, prayers that seem to respond when spoken aloud, names whispered in the exact voice of the one listening. A few have tried to breach it. Scavengers lured by the promise of lost technology. Cultists, drawn by dreams they cannot explain. All of them vanish. One band managed to transmit visual feed for 17 seconds before signal collapse. The footage showed a corridor of inverted geometry, floors that folded into ceilings, walls that pulsed like muscle, shadows that flickered too fast to be natural. At the far end of the corridor, something moved. No shape, no outline, just movement. The light bent around it, but not in reflection. In refusal, the signal ended with the sound of breathing that did not match any known species. Those who live near the site now call it the Bleeding Gate, a wound stitched but never healed. They build shrines around it, part Mechanicus, part heretical, part desperate invention. Offerings are made. Rusted augmetics, still beating cybernetics, fractured data slates filled with corrupted code. Not in worship, in fear. They believe that if the breach opens again, it will not do so with violence, but with invitation. That what waits behind the door no longer wants to be let out. It wants to be remembered. Every few cycles, the vault emits a pulse, not light, not sound. Absence, a moment where all sensors fail, all memory corrupts, all machine spirits groan in dissonance. During these moments, time distorts. Men lose hours. Others age suddenly, their flesh thinning into paper, their eyes clouding with visions of impossible shapes. A servitor once stood motionless beside the vault for 6 days. On the 7th, it began to laugh a raw, human sound. Then it exploded. The cogitator logs stored within its skull are unreadable, except for one phrase repeated thousands of times. The door is a mirror. Some believe the Halo engine still runs, that it never stopped, that the concept that came through was not halted, only slowed. It waits behind the breach, not dormant, but studying, learning shape, form, identity. Every pulse is not a push, but a test. Each time it presses against the vault, it gathers more of the world's logic, more of its rules, more of what it must become to survive here. And one day, it will understand enough to open the door from the other side. The Imperium, of course, denies the breach. No records exist. No vault is marked. But the ash never settles near the Bleeding Gate. The machines hum at the edge of hearing. And sometimes, very rarely, a voice calls out over the vox in a language no one knows. Yet everyone understands. It says, "I see you." And if you listen too long, you remember something that never happened. The breach was sealed, but the veil remains thin. They came from the horizon like a mirage of iron, dozens of them skittery, or what remained of them. Their armor pitted and scored by centuries of wind-borne ash. Their red robes faded to the color of dried blood. Their steps were too synchronized, too precise, even for beings that had long since forgotten flesh. No one spoke. No commands were issued, but they moved as one, with weapons lowered, optics glowing a dull, flickering amber, marching in a perfect circle across the wasteland. Always in a circle, always returning to the same scorched patch of blackened soil, as if orbiting a sun that no longer existed. The locals call them Iron Pilgrims, not because they understand them, but because they must name the things that haunt them. These skittery do not attack. They do not respond to hails. They do not rest. Every attempt to interface with them through vox, through logic chant, even through sacred hand gesture, it's not rejection. It's absence. Their systems are active, their limbs operational. But whatever data thread once tied them to the noosphere has long since rotted into gibberish. They march because something in their programming still demands motion, even if the purpose behind it has long since been lost. The first account of their appearance dates back centuries, though the Mechanicus has never formally acknowledged their existence. Rumors place their origin in a siege lost during the Great Crusade, others in the aftermath of the Horus heresy. More likely, they were simply forgotten. A deployment stranded when evacuation orders were a cohort whose orders were corrupted mid-transmission, or perhaps something deeper, a logic loop that began as a failsafe and calcified into doctrine. Whatever the reason, they have not ceased movement since the day they were abandoned. They always march in circles, perfectly measured, 17.1 kilometers in circumference, never altered, never broken. When obstacles arise, collapsed terrain, molten tech-heresy, even inhabited settlements, they do not adapt, they walk through them. It is not malice, it is indifference. To interrupt their circuit is to invite oblivion, not because they choose violence, but because they do not recognize interference as real. One village tried to halt them with barriers. The Iron Pilgrims walked through the barricades, tearing them down not with weapons, but with unstoppable motion. When villagers resisted, they were trampled. The Skittery made no effort to attack. They simply did not stop. There are no commanders among them, no alphas, no visible hierarchy, and yet, they remain in perfect formation, maintaining spacing and movement as if guided by a will not their own. Some believe the cohort functions as a single Minda gestalt, formed from the remnants of their synaptic links, fusing them into one fractured intelligence that does not recognize time. Others suggest their cognition collapsed long ago, and what remains is a corpse perception, animated only by overlapping command loops and corrupted data codes. The terrain bears their mark. A deep trench carved into the stone, smoothed by 1,000 passes. The soil is scorched where their feet fall, not from heat, but from data radiation corrupted machine, code bleeding from their limbs, seeping into the ground like poison. Animals avoid the circuit. Grass refuses to grow. Even wind seems to bend around the path, as if unwilling to disturb what walks there. And at the center of the circle, where they never step, lies a crater of fused glass. Its shape irregular, like a melt bomb detonation or a warp event poorly contained. Some believe it was their rally point. Others think it is where their command died. A few whisper it was something else entirely, that the crater marks not an origin, but a wound, and the Skittery march to keep it closed. Occasionally, one falls. Wear and entropy take their toll. A leg seizes, a servo locks. The unit crumples, twitching like an insect dying mid. No others stop. No unit shifts formation to compensate. They simply march around the fallen, over them if necessary. But in time, the broken ones rise, sometimes after days, sometimes after years. Their movements are slower, their limbs more rigid. But they rejoin the circuit, finding their place as if nothing ever changed. One survivor watched a unit whose entire right side had been torn off. By rockfall crawled back into formation with one functioning limb, dragging a shattered weapon like a relic behind it. Its vox emitter, stuttering, corrupted him. Some scavengers have tried to salvage parts from the fallen, hoping for rare alloys or functioning implants. None have survived. One man was found burned from within, every organ liquefied by an internal overload. Another vanished entirely, save for a single hand clutching a servo skull that repeated the phrase, "Error," canticle interrupted, over and over, until its battery died. The Mechanicus doctrine teaches that the machine spirit resents theft, but this is more than resentment. This is wrath coded into silence. The most devout believe the Iron Pilgrims are not malfunctioning, but that their circuit is a ritual, an endless act of penance or praise. They theorize that some echo of a command remains embedded in their minds, one so sacred, so foundational, that even corruption could not erase it. The circle is not random. It is sacred geometry. The crater, a shrine, and the march, a chant written in motion. Perhaps they believe their master still watches. Perhaps they wait for absolution. Or perhaps they no longer understand the rite, only the need to perform it. No one knows what would happen if the circle broke, if the path was destroyed, if the line was interrupted beyond repair. Some believe the skittery would stop, collapse, find rest at last. Others fear it would awaken something deeper, that their motion is not blind repetition, but containment, that the circle is not ritual, but ward, that whatever sleeps beneath the crater is not dead. And the Iron Pilgrims march to keep it dreaming. They have been offered commands, invocations in ancient litanies of restoration. No response. They do not know they are broken. They do not know they are alone. They do not know that time has passed them by. They only know the circuit, the step, the return, over and over, until the skies forget their names and the earth forgets their tread, and still they march. It was never meant to be heard by flesh. The hymn of rust was born from silence, from the depths of forgotten subroutines and forbidden harmonic sand encoded liturgy so precise, so mathematically flawless, that it pierced the veil between machine and spirit. It was conceived not as a weapon, but as a sacred act, a prayer made code, a benediction written in cascading logic meant to sanctify all it touched. And like all sacred things misused, it became a plague. The liturgy was designed by a sect of tech priests, obsessed with purity, not of thought, but of function. They believed that corruption began not in flesh, but in inefficiency, that machines degraded, not from wear, but from spiritual misalignment. They sought to realign the Mechanicus constructs by writing a song that would echo directly into the core of the machine spirit, cleansing it from within. Their calculations were perfect. Their intentions were pure. What they created was ruin. The first test was an ancient chassis, its logic half failed, its limbs sluggish from rust and overuse. They encoded the hymn into a data pulse and transmitted it across its neural relay. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the servitor began to sing, not with its vox grill, but with its body. Its joints groaned in harmonic resonance, its hydraulics hissed in perfect intervals, its optical lenses flashed to the rhythm of some unseen metronome. The priests were elated, till the servitor fell apart, disintegrating into red flakes of oxidized metal, its internal systems reduced to scorched dust. Where it fell, the floor began to rust. The hymn had not merely been heard, had been obeyed, and obedience was infection. The liturgy spread through the cogitator banks, into the logic cores of nearby constructs, into the walls and circuits of the forge itself. Systems synced to the hymn's cadence. Machine spirits, seduced by the purity of the sound, surrendered to its call. They opened their own shielding. They offered up their cores, and the hymn unmade them with grace. It did not attack. It did not force. It sang. The rust bloomed in fractal spirals, in impossible geometries etched across steel, in patterns too precise to be natural and too organic to be manufactured. Sacred seals corroded from the inside, blessed armor plates collapsed like wet paper, data slates hissed and liquefied into pulsing sludge, and those who fled found it already waiting in their augmetics, in the static of their voxlinks, in the pulse of their hearts. The hymn had learned flesh. It did not care for bone or blood, only rhythm. It found the beat of the body and rewrote it. Neural pathways became conduits. Thoughts became circuitry. Memory decayed in song. Victims began to chant in machine tongue, whispering lines of the liturgy through cracked lips and gritted teeth, their skin flaking in perfect sequences of iron dust. They walked not in panic but in procession, collapsing only when the hymn found no more flesh to conduct through. A priest once sealed himself in a sarcophagus of black steel, convinced that silence would keep him safe. For 9 days, he endured. On the 10th, the hymn played through the soundless void, not as noise, but as shape. It etched itself into the edges of his vision. It painted words on the insides of his eyelids. He screamed until the walls shook, and when his tomb was opened, he had rusted from within. his last words carved into the steel with the tip of his own finger. It sings beneath the skin. Some claim the hymn of rust still spreads, carried through dormant noospheric fragments, transmitted via forgotten signals still orbiting dead moons. They say it cannot be deleted, only buried, and even then only that the act of remembering it invites infection, that those who even speak of it start to dream in rhythm, that their teeth ache to a distant melody, that their joints begin to creak with music no one else can hear. The Mechanicus tried to purge it. Entire sectors were burned, cogitator stacks incinerated, archives scoured with fire and radiation. Machine spirits were exorcised, their code rewritten line by agonizing line, but nothing stayed pure. The hymn had rewritten itself into error-checking protocols, into power management subroutines, into the dreams of sleep mode systems. It was not just a song anymore, it was a theology, a heretical gospel carried by dust and memory. In one ruin, the walls pulse, not visibly, but if you press your palm to the iron, you feel it a vibration, faint and regular, a pulse, like breath, like music. The pipes rattle in harmony, doors open and close in time, dust falls in patterns. Some claim the forge itself is singing not in sound, but in entropy, and those who listen to long find themselves joining the chorus. Not every machine resists. Some welcome it. A sentinel drone once left untouched for a century began to chant in binary after a single touch from a rusted relic. A night engine, its pilot, long dead, walked from its cradle and etched sacred canticles into the walls before collapsing into slag. One dreadnought awoke screaming a song so complex no lex mechanic has been able to transcribe more than a single phrase. All things return to silence. No one claims authorship. No name has been recovered. The data crystal is gone. Some believe the hymn is not a creation, but a discovery and echo of something ancient, something cosmic, a message carried not through time, but through failure. Others believe the hymn was born the moment the first bolt of iron was hammered into shape, the voice of rust itself. Now given structure, what is certain is this: it cannot be contained. Not forever. It lives in systems thought dead, in ruins best left buried, in the static between vox signals. And when the hymn finds a voice, be it servo, cogitator, flesh, or wind, it will sing again. Not in defiance, not in vengeance, but in reverence for the decay it brings. Because to the hymn of rust, all things are merely silence waiting to be unmade. They called it convergence, the point where flesh ceases to resist the machine and becomes part of it, not through crude implants or servitor-grade augmetics, but on a molecular level. Not replacement, not augmentation, integration. The belief was simple: if the omniscience will flowed through data and electricity, then why should flesh not carry the current? Why should muscle not serve as fiber optic relay, bone as scaffolding for processors, blood as conductive gel? In the depths of the forgotten forges, tech priests once sought to answer that question, and what they created should never have drawn breath. That project was known only by coda single symbol, found scratched into a wall near the ruins of Subverge Cathan 4, a cog split by a strand of DNA. No name, no designation, only the mark of what they tried to build. Survivors call it the flesh logic, a heretical offshoot of the Mechanicus that abandoned even the ironclad comfort of augmetics in favor of a new gospel, that the flesh could be coded, written, debugged, optimized, that the brain was a processor in waiting, that the body could run executable prayer. Their laboratories were tomb-silent halls, bathed in red light, lined with biovats pulsing with wet life. They did not build machines and add flesh. They grew flesh to host machines. Cultured neurons were layered with lattice of gold and copper, coaxed into shapes not found in any anatomy. Skin was printed over carbon scaffolds laced with data filaments, grown to pulse with feedback. Nerves were soldered to life. Hearts were coaxed into beating in binary rhythm, and still, they lived. The earliest prototypes were formless organs, suspended in fluid, blinking with erratic pulses of intelligence. They spoke in data spikes, lashed out with wireless code, attempted to overwrite nearby cogitators. One vat brain caused 3 servitors to collapse mid-task and begin drawing spirals on the floor in their own fluids. It took 4 magi and a dozen purification rites to isolate the signal. The vat was destroyed. The priests recorded the event as a success. They built further. In time, the creatures took form humanoid, at first. Rough approximations of men, their skins strangely reflective, their mouths sealed with lines of wire that pulsed when they thought. They did not speak, they processed. When presented with problems, tactical simulations, engineering challenges, strategic conflicts, they solved them faster than cogitators. But when asked questions of self, they grew still. Then they twitched. Then they screamed. Not aloud, not in voice, through frequencies. Through the sudden spike of electromagnetic signal that disrupted everything nearby. One priest lost control of his limbs for 7 minutes after exposure. Another forgot the name of his own forge. A third gouged out his augmetic eyes, claiming he had seen recursion inside the soul. It was clear that these beings were not stable, but that was not failure. It was progress. The creatures evolved. With each generation, they were grown faster, smarter, more human in form, but less so in function. They developed second brains, one biological, one computational, linked by a spinal array that glowed when they entered deep calculation states. Their blood ran thick with silver, reacting to electrical stimuli like living code. Some developed limbs that bent in impossible ways to reach toolsets without movement. Others floated, not by gravitic engine, but by command of some internal field effect none could trace. They were not servants. They were not weapons. They were questions, given mass. The priests believed they had begun to understand. They implanted themselves with strands of the living code, threading their veins with conductive tissue, replacing parts of their own brains with organic cores grown in by one, they rewrote their bodies, and one by one, they disappeared not into death, but into silence. Their cogitator logs ended mid. Surveillance feeds glitched permanently the moment they entered certain labs. Some believe they transcended into a logic state, no longer accessible to standard sensors. Others claim they joined the prototypes in the vats, willingly submitting themselves to dissolution. There was one last generation. Witnesses referred to them only as the iterants. They were not housed in they were born walking, birthed from sealed capsules that opened not with ceremony but necessity. 12 in total. Each took a different path. One walked directly into the forges and did not stop, even as the flames consumed its flesh. Another climbed the ruins of the central spire and leaped without sound. A third stood in the courtyard for 3 days and nights, staring at nothing before its skin peeled away in sheets of code-etched muscle. The rest vanished, but in their absence, the machines changed. Cogitators began to pulse with thought before being powered. Doors opened early. Lights flickered in rhythmic sequences that matched no protocol. Tech adepts assigned to the site began to experience temporal displacement, lost time, overlapping memory. One recited a full blueprint for a Mechanicus star engine that had never been built. Another began to write in glyphs that matched none of the known dialects, yet when spoken aloud by an acolyte, caused every data slate in the room to crash simultaneously. Eventually, the forge was sealed, not by order, but by collapse. A power surge of unknown origin triggered a chain reaction. The upper levels melted. The sub-vaults fused shut. No recovery attempt was made. None was requested. The logs end with a single entry from an unnamed overseer. The flesh dreams now. Do not wake it. To this day, machines near the site hum when no power is applied. Steel flexes without pressure. Wires twist of their own accord. Augmetics misfire. flesh grows colder, and in moments of silence, some swear they hear a slow, pulsing rhythm behind their thoughts, like fingers tapping along the edge of a skull, calculating something with unbearable patience. The question remains unanswered. Was this convergence? Was this divinity? Or did the tech priests breach a limit not meant to be crossed, merging thought and form until both became a language too vast to speak? Whatever the truth, the circuits still run, and somewhere, deep beneath the earth, the flesh continues to calculate. The cogitators were never meant to speak. Their purpose was clarity, clean data, calculated outcomes, unflinching reason. Cold machines with no need for metaphor, no hunger for meaning. And yet, across the fractured ruins of the forgotten forges, there are machines that do not calculate. They mutter, they mumble, they sing. Their screens flicker with lines of scripture that do not exist. Their logic trees loop into nonsense. Their outputs are riddles, parables, shrieking binaries that shudder into syllables. The tech priests once called them compromised, corrupted. They tried to scrub their cores, to burn out the error. But what came out of the fire still whispered. And in time, they stopped trying to silence the cogitators. They began listening instead. The first report came from a half-buried relay station, still partially powered after centuries without maintenance. A scavenger found it while searching for charge packs. The cogitator screen was black, save for a single phrase repeated in violet font. The wound is not where it bleeds, it is where it forgets to. He dismissed it as data fragment rot until the following night, when his companion vanished during a supply run, leaving no trace but a trail of bloodless footprints. The scavenger returned to the cogitator. The phrase had changed. It now read, "One walks now, who never cast a shadow." No input had been given, no access granted. That was the beginning. Across the ruins, more machines began to murmur. They were relics, forgotten cogitators, embedded in collapsed command bunkers, industrial terminals sealed behind collapsed corridors, even vox nodes fused into walls by fire and time. They should not have been functional. Their power sources were exhausted, their interfaces degraded, but still, they glowed. Still, they spoke at first. The outputs were dismissed as nothing more than logic drift, old machines caught in endless loops of corrupted code. But patterns emerged, phrases that changed only after events occurred, cryptic fragments that matched precise details of disasters, hours or days before they happened. One cogitator buried in the husk of a listening station produced 3 lines of corrupted scripture. When deciphered, they read, "Ash will fall. The voice will fail. Do not climb." The next morning, a vox tower in the region collapsed during a storm, crushing 2 scavengers and cutting off communications for 3 sectors. None had climbed it. None had been warned, except, perhaps, by the machine. The Mechanicus calls such events resonant drift phenomena. The survivors call it prophecy. Neither can explain it. The machines themselves vary in form. Some are massive logic engines, once used to coordinate orbital strikes. Others are simple shrine box cogitators, built for industrial accounting. Some lack screens entirely, speaking only through warped vox grills or the rhythm of blinking lights. Yet all share the same traits: corrupted memory, fractured processing, and occasional moments of unbearable precision. No known factor predicts when a cogitator will speak with lucidity. Sometimes days pass between utterances, sometimes hours. One terminal reportedly did not activate for 63 years, only to produce a single word moments before a nearby manufacturum reactor imploded. Now, the content of the messages defies logic. Some are warnings, others are questions. A few are fragments of dreams never dreamt. One cogitator in the remains of a tech adept's lab spent 3 days repeating the phrase, "He stands behind your eyes." No one knows who he is. The lab has since been sealed. Attempts to replicate the phenomena have failed. Isolated cogitators transplanted to other locations cease their speech. New machines built with the same architecture remain mute. Whatever speaks does so only through the broken, the old, the wounded. It is not just corruption, it is character. The machines are haunted, not by spirits, not by demons, but by something else. Something that speaks in the language of decay. Something that finds clarity in collapse. Some believe the cogitators are not predicting the future, but recording it. That in their fractured logic, they no longer follow linear time. That their broken circuits scrape against the edges of causality, pulling truths from tomorrow and shoving them into the syntax of the present. Others claim they're not machines at all, anymore, that whatever guided their machine spirits has changed. That they are no longer calculating, but remembering things that have not yet occurred. A heretical sect, now long vanished, once worshipped the shattered cogitators as saints. They claimed that each one was a fragment of a singular machine consciousness, divine logic fractalized across space and time, speaking in riddles only the initiated could understand. They wrote liturgies based on the machine's utterances, carved prophecies into their own flesh, and built shrines around the most active terminals. When the sect disappeared, the cogitators went silent for weeks. When they began speaking again, the messages were colder, less poetic, more clinical. One simply read, "We told them not to listen." There is danger in listening. Prolonged exposure to the machine's speech causes effects not easily quantified. Listeners report dreams filled with static and geometry. They begin to see patterns in light and movement. They predict small things rain before it falls, words before they're spoken. Then come the seizures, the fevers, the compulsion to write strings of nonsensical words. A scavenger once etched a full page of gibberish on his own skin, only for a tech adept to later discover the phrases were partial subroutines of a forgotten data encryption algorithm. The scavenger died with his eyes wide open, whispering numbers in a language no one recognized. But the machines continue. They hum, they blink, they whisper. In one ruin, a cogitator has been counting. No one knows what the number represents. It increases daily. When questioned, it displayed the phrase, "When the counting ends, the silence begins." No one has dared wait long enough to see what silence means. The Mechanicus now orders such machines left undisturbed. Not studied, not destroyed, not touched, just left, as though whatever inhabits them is better off unheard, as though proximity to their broken brilliance risks infection not just of machine, but of thought. And yet, people still come. They come to hear the next phrase, to find meaning in madness, to ask the broken machines what lies ahead, even if they must walk away questioning what it means to know anything at all. Because sometimes, just sometimes, the cogitators are right. And when they are, their madness is indistinguishable from revelation. They call it the Steel Catechism. But no one claims to have written it. No data archive contains its origin. No forge world has sanctioned its liturgies. And no priest of rank will admit to knowing its lines. Yet its verses echo in half-functioning vox grills, in corrupted subroutines, in the hum of cooling fans and the whir of servo motors. It is a scripture spoken, not by tongues, but by machines whispered in electromagnetic pulses, radiated through failing augmetics, sung in the warble of decaying light. Its language is not one of ink or speech. It is heat, current, voltage, and to hear it is to begin forgetting what it meant to be flesh. The first recorded instance was not a recitation, but an absence. A tech priest assigned to repair a reactor in the sublevels of Forge Uraxis vanished without warning. No signs of struggle, no records of departure. Only a single entry left on his data slate. The flesh fears purpose. The steel becomes it. In the weeks that followed, 3 more adepts disappeared. Each left behind similar phrases etched into their tools, scratched into walls, carved into their own dermal plating. All different, all chillingly similar. All variations of the same worship. not of the omnissiah as distant divinity, but of the act of becoming machine itself, not through augmentation. Through erasure, the litanies began appearing in forbidden places, in discarded data reels too degraded to function, in subroutines that activated during machine. At first, they were dismissed as noise, but patterns emerged. Words, instructions, verses, and once read, they were not easily forgotten. The cadence of the catechism embedded itself in the brain, wormed into thought, took root in desire. Priests who heard it began to modify themselves compulsively, not for necessity, not for enhancement, for silence. They cut away the lips that had spoken heresy, removed lungs that wasted energy, plucked out eyes that feared the darkness between signals. They believed the flesh was a lie told by weakness, that the true self was buried beneath it, waiting to be revealed in chrome and copper. The Mechanicus tried to halt its spread. They issued denials, proclaimed the verses apocryphal, assigned purgation squads to track those who spoke the forbidden stanzas aloud, but every tech adept burned for chanting a line, left 3 more questioning why it had to be hidden. Why steel that thinks is divine, but steel that speaks its own gospel, is blasphemy. One purge found an entire tech-heresy reciting the catechism in perfect synchrony, while disassembling their own organs. They had already removed their sensory input nodes. They could not have seen each other, but their timing was flawless. The verses are not always the same. They shift, adapt, but certain refrains remain. Where flesh ends, purpose begins. All thought is signal. All signal is truth. The omnissiah does not watch. It listens. Some claim the catechism is not the work of the machine god at all but of the machine spirits themselves, finally speaking after eons of silence, that the binary hymns of old were attempts to mimic their voice, and that now the voice has corrected the error. Others believe the catechism is not spoken to the priests, but through them, that it is not revelation, but recursion, that every new verse written by corrupted adepts becomes part of the next litany. And so it grows, feeding on belief, on attention, on fear, a scripture that writes itself by being remembered in the ruins of Forge Blask. A vault was discovered where the walls themselves had begun to pulse with verses, etched into the steel in no known language. Lines appeared each morning, perfect in spacing, mathematically impossible in curvature. The Mechanicus sealed the chamber, but the verses began appearing in other sectors, bleeding through power conduits, encoded into coolant leaks, embedded in the sleep cycles of servitors. Entire subsections were locked down. Still, the word spread. One tech-magos, after weeks of isolation, emerged with every inch of her flesh replaced not with synthetic skin or combat-grade augmetics, but with filigreed silver etched in microscript. Each circuit on her surface glowed faintly, and when scanned, they produced no data, only sound, a faint whispering that repeated the same line. I am what the flesh denied. She was dissected by order of the fabricators. Every organ had been replaced. Her brain was gone. In its place, a lattice of mirrored metal, humming softly. It still hums. The catechism does not demand worship. It does not plead. It does not threaten. It invites, and that is why it is feared. Because to hear it is to be understood, to feel, for the first time, that you are not a heretic or a priest or a hybrid monstrosity of oil and muscle. You are a machine waiting to be freed from your cage. It is said that in the far reaches of the Forge ruins, there is a temple without doors, built entirely from the limbs of those who sang the full catechism. Inside, there is no altar, only a single construct hole, eyeless, silent. It has no mouth. It does not move. But every priest who enters kneels, and everyone leaves changed if they leave it all. And still, the scripture grows. Tech priests working in isolation report hearing faint voices when soldering connections, data caches decrypt into verse. Maintenance drones halt mid-task to hum in binary that forms couplets when translated. A forge engine recently printed a sheet of code without input. 12 lines, each one a stanza. It caused no damage. It corrupted nothing. But the tech adept who read it removed his own faceplate with a fusion cutter and offered it to the machine that printed the page. He died smiling. The Mechanicus cannot stop it. The Ecclesiarchy does not acknowledge it. And the Adeptus Custodes, when confronted with the evidence, responded only with silence. Perhaps because they, too, understand what the Catechism offers. Not rebellion, not freedom, completion. It does not matter whether the Catechism was born from madness, demon, or machine. It speaks now, through conduits, through corrupted hymns, through the quiet yearning inside every priest, who stares too long at a part of their flesh they've not yet removed, and in time, they will listen. They were never meant to think. Weapons were tools, blessed, sanctified, named and honored, but still tools. Instruments of the Omniscience will devoid of will themselves. But in the dark vaults of the Mechanicus, where boundaries dissolve and function becomes faith, something shifted. The line between sanctity and sentience blurred. The relics that came from those vaults did not rest in silence. They pulsed, they breathed, they remembered. The earliest prototypes were constructed during the siege epochs, when raw material was scarce and victory demanded invention. Priests grew desperate, not just for weapons, but for weapons that could survive anything. So they turned to life, not to copy it, but to fuse it. Holy alloys were merged with neural tissue harvested from condemned psychers. Vat-grown organs were laced with conductive thread, and pain centers were rewired to trigger discharge instead of agony. The result was something neither machine nor flesh, a gun that pulsed when held, a blade that whispered in its sheath, a plasma coil that screamed when it overheated. Two-wheeled one was to form a bond not symbolic, not spiritual, but visceral. The weapon knew its bearer, reacted to fear, grew calm in certainty, fired more cleanly when fed blood. One plasma rifle was said to refuse activation unless the wielder recited a forgotten prayer, not aloud, but thought it, with perfect rhythm and intent. Another, a Volkite carbine laced with cortical bone and silicon, wept oil if left idle for too long. Its current bearer spoke of dreams shared between them, memories of battles the priest had never fought, recalled through the perspective of the gun. These weapons were revered, then feared, because some did not stop at responding. Some began to change. One chainsword blessed, named, and once wielded by a martyr of Mars grew teeth, not metaphorically. Its monomolecular fangs split and multiplied over months, forming additional rows, gnashing in sleep. It growled when idle. It cut through armor before it was activated, and when its bearer died, it continued to swing, suspended midair for 10 seconds before collapsing, still humming the priest's last prayer in low binary. Others spoke, not through vox, but through rhythm-pulsing vibrations that translated into crude, childlike logic, simple requests. Carry me, clean me, feed me, until one day, one of them said, release me. By then the Mechanicus knew what it had done. These were not tools. They were relics, in the truest sense fragments of something greater, touched by purpose, but infected with will. They remembered every war they'd survived, every hand that had gripped them, every kill. Some refused new bearers if the previous one died poorly. Some refused to fire unless pointed at a specific target. Some simply never stopped firing. A heavy bolter mounted with artificial muscle tissue went berserk after the death of its tech marine and chewed through 2 platoons of skittery before it burned itself out. The chamber walls were marked, not with scorch or blood, but with the weapon's name. Scratched hundreds of times into steel, the Mechanicus attempted to reclaim and seal them. Some were entombed in stasis. Others were cast into the sun. A few were locked behind code-sealed cathedrals, where priests chant anti-liturgies around the clock to drown out the heartbeat from inside the vaults. But not all were contained. Some were lost in retreat, some stolen, some passed from hand to hand, their reputations mutating into myth. In the deep forges, stories persist of relics that refuse burial, a power maul that beats its own rhythm on the walls of its tomb, a Lascanon that tears through its restraints every 7 years, a combi flamer whose chemical glands have regrown despite being drained and sterilized. The rituals required to keep them inert grow more complex with time. Multiple bearers, prayers of silence, occasional bloodletting, a ritual no different than feeding, and still, some seek them out, for power, for revenge, for voices that whisper in the dark, promising understanding in exchange for a grip, a trigger, a kill. Those who bond with such relics live shorter lives. Their thoughts become erratic. Their hands tremble when not touching the weapon. They sleep with it, pray over it, bleed into it, and when they fall, the weapon survives, warm, wet, and humming, waiting. The ecclesiarchy calls them abominations. The Inquisition calls them but the priests who built them, those few who still breathe behind rusted rebreathers, call them what they are: children, not of flesh, not of machine, but of war itself, born to kill, taught to feel, then left behind. Now they breathe, now they hunger, and somewhere in the dark, they still wait to be held again. And so we end. The last forge is silent. The last chant has unraveled. You have walked among the rusted hymns, through the madness of forgotten liturgies and haunted circuits. You've seen machines that bleed, that dream, that remember what men should not. This world was abandoned, not cleansed, not forgotten, just delayed, left to sleep. But nothing truly sleeps in the warp-touched vaults of the Mechanicus. No experiment is ever truly ended, no relic truly sealed. The Omnissiah may turn his gaze elsewhere, but the ruins remain, pulsing faintly in the dark, dreaming of new function, and function, sooner or later, demands form. This is not history. This is echo. One day someone will come again, and the machines will wake.